You talk about the Swiss Volksbank in the 30s getting in trouble. Really, it sounded like part of that was coming through the Great Depression. How did Swiss banking change at that time as banks ran into trouble during the 30s?
Yeah, so I mean, the really interesting thing that develops in Switzerland in the late 20s and late 30s is around this idea of bank secrecy, which is a crucial piece of the culture of Swiss banking, I think. And they try to sort of rewrite what that was about at different times, but essentially, the Swiss banks realized that to survive, come alongside much bigger banks and a bigger banking industry in other countries, what did they have to offer? And the big thing they had to offer was you could put your money there and nobody knew where it was, and they would never tell anybody, who'd put the money there and that kind of thing. Yeah. This was sort of informal for a long time, but it became kind of formalized in the 1930s. The Times Switzerland has tried to say the reason for that was because you had this wave of Nazism and other kind of extremist politics sort of washing across Europe, and this was a helpful thing to offer to clients. You can come put your money in Switzerland, and we won't let the Nazis get their hands on it. There is a pretty strong argument to say it was almost the other way around, right? Anyone can put our money here, no matter what your political views or what kind of things you're up to, and we won't question it. Sure. And I guess, which one of those is, they're both the same thing, right? They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Well, the other thing I think of whenever I'm in Switzerland is, again, Switzerland's unique in that, you go to Geneva and you go to Zurich, and they have very old buildings there. And they have very old buildings there because they've never been in a war.
Yeah.
In effect.
I think that neutrality thing is really interesting, right? Because neutrality and staying kind of like out of wars and not picking sides, on the one hand sounds like, well, these are the good guys, right? They decide not to fight. On the other hand, I think there's another way of looking at it, which is this like amorality, where the Swiss politically are saying one thing. In their banks, I think they're essentially saying, we don't care who you are, we will do business with you. We will do business with anyone who is willing to put their money here.
Yeah, it's a very passionless, or there is no right and there is no wrong kind of view, and eventually, whether it's right or wrong, they did end up having to choose what was right and wrong, and that ruined. To your point, I think you pointed out in your book, you called it wasn't a problem, it was a feature, is how they looked at it.
This was like one of the best things they had to offer, right? Like they had something to offer, which is we won't ask any questions. But that obviously it becomes sort of self-fulfilling, right? You attract people who have something to hide.
Yeah. So a broader question though, how much do you look at just that to be really what drove, the big Swiss banks like Credit Suisse and UBS in the 20th century? In other words, like let's say up to 2000, do you think that was by far the most important reason that their customers came to them, or was that not really the main storyline of their success up until those points?
I think it's really important. I think it's hugely important. Otherwise, how else do you explain, why Switzerland becomes this center of banking? There's this sort of you could say link to it is the idea of neutrality, right? So that it's a relatively safe place to put your money. But the secrecy, I guess, is the very similar ideas, right? Secrecy, I think, is really appealing to a lot of people, which means you can avoid not just sort of, it's not just bad guys trying to avoid like the regulators getting their money, but it's people who are trying to avoid tax as well. And arguably some of those are bad people.
Well, I was going to say, now that we got rid of Swiss banking, that's what crypto was made for, right?
Well, exactly. It's a similar, the appeal is similar for sure, right? But I think there are other elements of Switzerland. A stable currency was appealing, right? But again, these things all kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, no, I agree. So can you teach us, when I was reading this story, I think a lot of Lugano. Lugano is this beautiful city in the south of Switzerland. And, why do I think Lugano existed for many wealthy people? Because the Italians could come up from Milan and dump their money into Lugano, and then no one had to know. And you tell a story about the Credit Suisse branch in Chiasso. So can you tell that story, what happened in that, and why it seemed like it was great for the bank, but obviously it didn't end up working out.
Yeah, well, it's exactly as you're talking about with Lugano, right? So there's a particular manager in a branch in this place, Chiasso, and it's not not a big town, but it happens to sit on the other side of a tunnel to Italy. And this guy is in a sort of competitive banking environment, and he decides he needs to appeal to wealthy Italians who want to deposit their money in Switzerland, and so he offers them incredible rates. Incredible interest rates on anything they deposit. And he's going to try and how's he going to pay for that? He decides he'll pay for it with it ends up being a kind of Ponzi scheme / slush fund that is invested in all sorts of weird assets and that ultimately don't pay out. And the whole thing collapses. And in the meantime, this one tiny branch has become incredibly important to the bank's results. It's sort of ridiculous, and people are turning a blind eye to it because it's there's clearly something wrong, but it's generating so much revenue, and the guy is becoming a bit of a star. Maybe one day he's going to be a senior executive at the bank, and then when it all blows up, of course, everybody suddenly is sort of hand wringing. It almost, I think off the top of my head, I think it was about $1 billion it cost the bank, which at the time was just enormous, and it's enormous now too, but it was really enormous then. And ultimately could have killed Credit Suisse at that point, and didn't, really by luck as much as anything else. But it's a terrible tale of how people inside the bank are willing to turn a blind eye to things that are obviously wrong if it's making money.
Yeah, when I think, and by the way, if I remember correctly, Texon was the company he created. And to
Correct.
your point, in a Ponzi scheme-like fashion, he did buy the debt of some real entities. It just ended up not working out for them either. So, but to your point about this star, it's like, okay, and it gets to the idea of like what you show on your net income statement versus what's going on in your balance sheet. So to your point, they're booking these profits because they're getting all these deposits, and I'm sure they're showing an underwriting profit from that process. And I'm sure some of that is ending up in deposits with the bank, not all in Texon in some way, and just causing a lot of customer flow, if you will, which, as everyone on this podcast should know, banks need deposits because that's your cost of equity in a way on a bank, and you can lend that out. But I say that because this was not a one-off. This is really a recurring theme that shows up, is the idea of a star in a particular location. And to your point, is that a very sustainable business?
Yeah, I think you're right that this kind of occurs over and over and over again with Credit Suisse. And I tried to figure out, part of what I'm doing with the book is trying to figure out why does that happen over and over. I think part of it is they're never the biggest bank, right? They're never the biggest bank in Switzerland. They're never the biggest asset manager. They're not as big when they try to go global. They're not as big as their global competitors. And so they're always looking for something that is going to, accelerate their growth. And of course, that leads you to take bigger risks. And often it means they, in particular, bet on star bankers who they think will deliver this like enormous kind of transformation. But more often than not, these star bankers don't have any magic, don't have any secret sauce, and they end up blowing up. And I think that's a real problem. It's sort of culturally why it leads to a sort of, it becomes self-reinforcing again, because you have one of these guys, now you got to get another one, and your bank never catches up because you're constantly blowing up.